no, man. I get up. So yeah, I recently tried fixing my sleep schedule slightly. So for example, yesterday I went to bed at like 12 a.m., hoping to get up at like 7 and, nice and early. I still ended up getting up at 11 a.m., so that didn't work out. But, slowly but steadily, I'm thinking of, I mean, maybe if I become a little more careful with my routine, I will feel better about my day, because these days I don't know what is happening. Like I wake up and then it's like the sun is not there anymore. And then I'm like, okay, it's late, so let's just watch a movie or something. So
I think that having a good schedule or even having a good sleep schedule is like totally overrated. Like for one, because
it is, but
I mean, because there is like the science on sleep is anyways very disputed. So you'll see in a lot of places that like you should at least get 6 to 8 hours of sleep or something. But that's just like it's a bro fact. It's not an actual scientific fact that you can
right,
find
right,
anywhere.
right,
So I mean,
right. No,
sleep
no,
is a
but
very weird thing. So what
it's
I've
just
seen,
that like you need sleep to recover though. Like if you're working out and you're playing football and then the next morning you wake up all
right? But
sore, you need
do you know
sleep to
the thing
recover.
is? So I was very bored over the past year, like expectedly. So I tried to map out my circadian rhythm. Like I tried to see what are the times where I actually feel sleepy, and I do not.
Right. Interesting.
So I realized that my like according to my whatever the kind of clock that I might have inside, the the time that I feel the most sleepy at night is around 10 or 10:30. So I tried sleeping at 10:30 for a week or so. So what I realized was that if I sleep exactly at the time when I start feeling very drowsy and sleepy, the optimum amount of sleep that I require is 5 hours. So after 5 hours, I'll be totally
Right.
awake, like like exactly like totally alert after waking up, which is like totally like which is a weird concept for me because every time I sleep for like 10 or 11 hours every day, and then I wake up drowsy, and like for the first half an hour after that, I don't know anything of what's happening around me, and then I pick up my mobile phone and whatever. So for me, sleep is usually I sleep at like 4 in the morning, then sleep for 10 hours. And so that was like a totally new concept for me. Like if you try to find out the times when you actually feel very drowsy and sleepy and you sleep at those times. So what I realized was that personally it was like 5 hours of sleep, which seemed to be optimum for me. And also the cool thing is that if I sleep for those 5 hours, I'll not feel tired at all in the entire day. Like probably around noon, you can start feeling a bit drowsy, but then you can take an half an hour nap, and then you will be wide awake for the entire day.
Right.
So I
I
mean
mean,
that's the thing.
feeling sleepy during the day. Like, let's say you've had a nice 5 6 hours stretch of sleep, and then if you still find yourself sleepy in like 3 hours from waking up or something, that mostly has to do with your insulin levels and your sugar levels in the blood. It doesn't really have to do with the like lack of sleep or anything.
Right.
So there's a lot of factors that go into there, but I think I'll probably try your circadian rhythm experiment one of these days. I've tried messing about with sleep schedules, like as you guys know. I tried the Schwinger thing. I even tried this. I think it's called the Uberman schedule, where you basically like take 2 hour naps every 2 hour or something like that.
What?
20-minute naps every 2 hours or something like that. I tried that too for 2 days. Yeah, I tried that. Like I did not do it for too long. I did it for like 2 days maybe, and then I had such a terrible headache that I just gave up on it. It's also very incompatible with my general activity level, right? Because I
Right.
generally have a high activity level, so
Yeah.
I need like rest. Otherwise, I'm just hurting all over. So,
Right.
but I will try this experiment mapping out circadian rhythm.
Yeah. I
Santosh
mean,
has a very fixed schedule. I know for sure because yeah, he sleeps at like 2 3 fixed, gets up at 9, and then he has a nap in the afternoon. So I can't nap in the afternoon. I just physically can't. So I need like one stretch of sleep.
These days, my afternoon nap is gone. Like I'm sleeping at 3 in the night and getting up at 11 in the morning and just working through the whole day.
Yeah, because you're having Shivsagar dosas.
what?
Yeah, I'm already regretting it, dude. Like I'm already regretting.
Yeah, if you need us to stop the recording because you have to run to the washroom or something, let us know. Oh, I want to listen to your conspiracy theories, but let's save that for the end because I think our sort of protocol is that we first talk physics and then we talk like enjoyable stuff. So
Okay. But I
Okay.
don't think I'll be talking about
Worldwide.
the conspiracy theory because it seems that the internet police, the YouTube and Google
Right.
algorithms, they are trying to censor down everything that like that seems to be spreading misinformation about COVID. So things actually get shut down if you like,
Unquote misinformation.
even if it's like in quotes. So even if it's like a joke or something, like even if you're making a joke, if it seems to have any kind of vaccine misinformation or misinformation about COVID, they'll get a very good opportunity to shut you down. So that should probably be left in
Right.
out of the air.
Right. Before we know it, we get another call from COSA. This time they ask us, why is the Interpol calling us? But okay. Well, physics. I mean, lately I've basically been thinking about addressing all of these, swampland conjectures, basically conjectures that were motivated from string theory and all of these things. And recently people are trying to think about them in terms of the like from an IR perspective without talking about specific UV completion. Because you see, there's a this is called standing under the string lamppost. You guys might have heard of this, but because we've spent so many years, looking for theories that must be consistent with string theory and must agree with the predictions of string theory, or in some limit reduced to string theory or something. It looks like we might miss out on a lot of other interesting theories just because we're too caught up with string theory. So this is what is colloquially called standing in the string lamppost, and you miss a lot of stuff. So there's a lot of very, very interesting conjectures that come from string theory. Some of them have been conclusively, not conclusively, but let's just say they've been disproved in some sense. Some of them, what usually happens is that somebody finds a counter example and then they make the statement weaker and weaker and weaker until the statement has like no practical utility at all. So, for example, you guys must have heard of the weak gravity conjecture. In its strongest form, the weak gravity conjecture basically says that in words, one could say that gravity is the weakest of all forces. And I mean, technically speaking, it would mean that the charge to mass ratio, or the ratio of charges of some global symmetries to the charge of gravity, which is mass, is bounded. So this is the weak gravity conjecture in its strongest form. Now people have been claiming to find counterexamples for a really long time. So it keeps getting toned down into weaker and weaker gravity conjectures until I think there's the current thing that's being floated around is that there exists at least one charge such that the charge to mass ratio is greater than one. I know this is like a completely silly statement to make. It has absolutely no power at all. So, but the interesting thing is now people are trying to probe these conjectures from just effective field theories in the IR, because it doesn't look like there's going to be any consensus soon about the quantum theory of gravity, and our best bet is just to look at effective field theories and see if we can get physical insight from them. So, for example, a very interesting thing you can show is that in 3 and 4 dimensions at least, the weak gravity conjecture is precisely equivalent to your usual unitarity bounds that follow from causality, analyticity, and all of this. And now this is a sacred principle. You see, the weak gravity conjecture is not a sacred principle. It's like just some conjecture that's motivated from examples known in string theory, etc. Extremal black holes to be specific. But the unitarity and analyticity, causality, these are very sacred principles. And so if you can, for example, somehow reduce the weak gravity conjecture to this, then it has more solid footing. So at least in some special cases like Einstein-Maxwell theory in 3 and 4 dimension, you can show that they're completely equivalent. But aside from that, there are some arguments where you compactify your theories to remove the T-channel pole and so on, and then you can show that they're still equivalent. But that's mostly just why the hell is Santosh liking an Instagram post I shared while we're recording the podcast? Okay.
Oh, I'm browsing through Instagram as well.
Yeah, very interesting.
I have a very short attention span. Yes, I'm certain.
Yes. No, that's all of us.
You are a very short guy.
But I can actually tell you something slightly. I mean, it's a specific example, but it's something interesting, I think. So when we derive, for example, positivity bounds or unitarity bounds, they basically arise from the analytic structure of the S matrix. So we say that we know the axioms of the S matrix say that basically there's the only non-analyticities you can have must be associated with physical processes. So, for example, you can have poles wherever you have bound states or one particle states, and you can have branch cuts starting from the smallest multi-particle state you can have. With massless particles, things become very tricky because then you have a branch cut extending all the way from the origin to infinity. But let's ignore that subtlety for a bit. And now you basically, for example, you just take some scattering, some amplitude, and you do a contour integral, and you pick up all the non-analyticities, and you find that because of the branch cuts, the branch cut contributes to the contour integral via the discontinuity across the branch cut. That's how complex analysis works. And this discontinuity is related to as I'm sure you guys remember from optical theorem, the discontinuity of the imaginary part of the amplitude is related directly to the cross section, and the cross section is strictly positive. And so this is the origin of positivity bounds. Now you can differentiate to whatever order you want in your Mandelstam variables, and you can keep extracting positivity for your coefficients. Now the thing is, all of this business also requires another assumption to go in, which is the fact that your amplitude is polynomially bounded. This assumption basically stems from locality, assuming that demanding that the S matrix is local. And Froissart proved a long time ago that the sufficient condition is that it's bounded by S squared. This is called the Froissart bound. When you write down your dispersion relation for your S matrix, the boundedness basically translates to the number of subtractions you can write down. And the number of subtractions are, the subtraction terms are basically the terms which will be there irrespective of analyticity. So it's not like everything in the S matrix is determined by analyticity. Some parts of it are specific to theory, because you see, this was Gell-Mann's original hope, that you should be able to fix the S matrix completely from unitarity, analyticity, all of this nonsense. But as we know, that's not quite true. And there is always some theory specific content in your S matrix. So which is why different theories will have different S matrices. So you can't. And so precisely this is the information that's encoded in the subtraction constants. So the part of the S matrix is specific to your theory. And this subtraction coefficients you cannot determine from any analyticity properties over here. Now the number of these subtractions depend on how badly your thing is bounded polynomially. So if it's bounded by S to the n, for example, then you'll have n minus 1 subtractions. You have n subtractions, which is a polynomial to the power n minus 1. So the Froissart bound says it's bounded by S squared, so now you have 2 subtractions. So basically, the sum total of this whole story is that assuming that your amplitude is bounded by S squared, you have 2 unknown parameters in your dispersion relation for the S matrix, which you cannot determine from analyticity. And so some coefficients, namely the coefficients that contribute up to order S squared and to your S matrix, you cannot fix the coefficients from analyticity. They are external inputs. But a very interesting thing happens if you study theories with fermions, because the thing is with all known theories with fermions, and I don't know of a rigorous proof for this, but at least in all the known examples, the fermion amplitudes actually are bounded by S and not S squared, like in the forward limit. So now you see, this kind of makes life easy for us, because if something is bounded by S instead of S squared, then you know that there are fewer subtraction constants. So you know that there is a smaller amount of information that is theory specific. You can determine more and more things by just unitarity or whatever. And there was a paper late last year by Remen and these people, which basically did this to constrain. If you try to study the standard model effective field theory, and you start looking at dimension 6 operators. Now the thing is, so I said that the amplitude is bounded by S. For a general amplitude, the piece of the amplitude that's proportional to S is part of the subtraction, and it cannot be determined by analyticity, as I just said. But if you but if you look at what kind of operators actually generate amplitudes that scale at S, then these are precisely operators of dimension 6. And this is just from power counting. You see, if you have a dimension 6 operator contributing to a 4-point function, then there is 2 residual powers of momentum left. So there's a p-squared dependence, so dependence on S. S is your Mandelstam variable. So now you know that there is a, so you now know that, so basically using standard analytic properties of the S matrix, you cannot constrain coefficients of dimension 6 operators in the standard model effective field theory. And this is because it's part of the subtraction coefficients. And what are dimension 6 operators? You can have things like, for example, partial pi to the cube. Partial pi to the cube, that's dimension 6, and there'll be a factor of momentum on each external leg, and then there's a propagator, so p to the 4 by p squared, so again as p squared. And the more interesting thing is fermionic operators, so something like e bar e bar e. I mean, okay, there's gamma mu, e bar gamma mu e bar gamma mu e, something like this. So these are precisely the operators that contribute to 2 to 2 scattering, a 4-point amplitude, and they come at dimension 6. And so now we see that these dimension 6 operators you cannot determine their coefficients by analyticity. However, with fermionic operators, like I said, the amplitudes obey a sort of stronger bound. They're not bounded by S squared, but by S, at least in all known examples. And this, this reduces the theory-specific content of the S matrix. It reduces the number of subtractions. Now you can work with just one subtraction. And what's even better is, if instead of the amplitude, you look at the first derivative of the amplitude, then this information also goes away. The subtraction, because the subtraction is proportional to this. So once you take a derivative, it goes away. So now this is our this is sort of the trick we're going to use to constrain to find bounds on operators of dimension 6. You assume that the bound is weaker than that of the Freuser bound, is stronger than that of the Freuser bound, and then you basically, so a crucial ingredient here again is you can't just do any kind of scattering to get your bounds. You need to scatter things with opposite helicities, and that's because the fundamental reason why positivity bounds exist, like I said, one way to look at it is the optical theorem, but the more practical way is to look at the partial wave amplitude, expansion of these amplitudes. And the partial wave expansion, it very directly relates to unitarity, simply requiring that, the modulus squared of these partial waves must be positive for the theory to be unitary. And this is like a simple way to guarantee unitarity. And the thing is, if you scatter opposite helicity particles, then the partial wave amplitude, then the partial wave expansion starts at j equal to 1. So there is no S wave contributing to the partial wave amplitude. It starts from waves with angular momentum 1. And this is very crucial because the discontinuity across the S and U channels, that's just basically saying that you first consider a scattering of some fermion AB with AB, and then an anti-fermion scattering AB bar and AB bar. And we know by SU crossing symmetry that they're related by the discontinuity across S and U channels. So this basically, by scattering opposite helicity particles, you can derive a bound on these. So this is not how exactly you do this is a technical matter, and I don't want to talk about integration here. But this has some very interesting consequences for looking for UV completions of the standard model. Because you see, our primary requirement was that the amplitude scales slower than S, not S squared. And this actually puts a lot of constraints on what kind of UV completions you can have in your theory. So for example, if you look at, an amplitude like a dimension 6 operator, like the 4 Fermi operator, like psi bar psi, something like that. There's many ways it can come in the effective field theory. The simplest possible way is there is some heavy scalar that's mediating, this exchange. So there's 2 fermions, and then there's a scalar being exchanged, and there's 2 fermions. And this kind of a diagram would contribute to the 4 Fermi operator in your EFT. Another would be something like a box diagram, just like one external leg, and then there is a square of intermediate exchange particles. And the thing with all of these is that as long as you have, it's intermediate, like the more complicated your Feynman diagram is, that is to say that there are more intermediate exchange states, so there are more propagators, so there are more powers of 1 by p squared, then you are safer and safer with your initial assumption that, the amplitude scales slower than s. So, I mean, if you have 4 intermediate particles, then you have a 1 by p to the 4 kind of thing. So it's all very nice. But if you try to UV complete your theory with a massive vector boson, then you immediately run into a problem, which is a very deep problem in all of standard model. And it's that a massive vector boson's propagator does not fall off as, 1 by p squared at large p. Because if you remember, the massive vector boson propagator is not just 1 by p squared as it is for a photon. It also has a minus p squared by whatever term to it. You see, for large p, instead of falling as 1 by p squared, it actually becomes a constant. And so if you try to UV complete your standard model where, your dimension 6 operators come from an exchanged massive vector boson state, then you have a lot of trouble with unitarity and causality. So something very simple, just a very simple thing like trying to constrain, some operators using unitarity actually gives you information about how you will have to UV complete your standard model. So now we know, for example, that it can't be UV completed with a massive vector boson for dimension 6 operators. So I mean, it's not something very profound, but I think it's an interesting progress, because at least at this stage we don't have much better hope than just looking at our standard model EFT and trying to see what constraints we can have on the UV completion. I think people have given up on trying to find the actual UV completion. We just hope to find more and more constraints on it and see how long can string theory survive the test. Because most of the things, for example, there's a lot of very, very interesting open problems here. Like, for example, Chetan might have heard of this because of, you were interested in string theory. It's often said that quantum gravity can have no global symmetries.
Right. But that's not a very string theory specific thing, right? It's something like your these swampland things only. Like, you can think of a very basic thought experiment about what will happen if you throw in a charge into a black hole.
Right. Yeah. So
and that will just
the argument I know, it just goes by saying that, well, I mean, if there was a global charge, then it would be eaten up by a virtual black hole or something.
Right.
And so, but all known like constructions
of. I don't get one thing, guys. Why can a quantum have no other global conserved charge?
A very simple reason is that if there was a conserved charge, I mean, if there was a global symmetry, and then there would be a conserved charge, locally conserved charge, as is crucial, and gravity has no local like gauge invariant observables.
Right.
So
it's either that or so there is another way of looking at this, like a thought experiment, which is, suppose you had a globally conserved charge or some globally conserved symmetry that corresponds to some charge. So you can think of it as you have a flat, asymptotically flat spacetime with just one black hole, and you have some charge lying around in your universe. But what happens if you throw in the charge into the black hole? So essentially, since that charge will now be shielded by the black hole, and eventually that the black hole will evaporate or something, so what you will have is a charge that should be conserved because of the fact that it's globally conserved in your space-time. But due to the evaporation of the black hole or whatever, since it goes into the event horizon, this charge is now lost from your universe.
Yes.
So one way of saying this is that your black hole will acquire this charge, but then over time, since it evaporates, there will be some final remnant form where the black hole will have, like, the charge will not change, but the mass of the black hole will keep on reducing. So there will be some point where the charge of the black hole will be greater than the mass in particular units, if you talk about it, which will sort of violate this positivity bound.
Oh, right.
And this is exactly where this
basically
that's precisely the violation of the
apart from the usual energy and momentum.
Right. So the way this,
or is it?
So you can the way you solve this in certain theories is by assuming that the black hole cannot radiate after a particular point, and that particular final state of that black hole is known as the extremal black hole. So, and an
Yes,
extremal black hole
precisely.
is the one where the charge is essentially equal to the mass, which is
Yeah,
very
that's
weird
that.
way of saying because the units
Yeah,
do not match. But in certain units, you can have your charge is equal to the mass. And the reason this is interesting is because you don't even have to talk about black holes and some gravitational theory to like get situations where you have something where the charge where you have this kind of a bound on your charges and masses. So a very easy place to look at this particular bound being satisfied is say your regular gauge theories. So suppose you have some U1 gauge theory. Uh, if you look at the instanton solutions of your U1 gauge theory, so what are instanton solutions? Essentially, if your theory, your like if you write down your theory in the form of field potentials F mu nu, then the instantons are those solutions that satisfy F mu nu equals the star of F mu nu, where like you sort of say that this is the self-dual part of the your field theory. These are the instanton solutions, also very related to the classical solutions of your field theory. So the point is that if you have, say, instanton solutions of your, say, an abelian gauge theory, you will find out that this instanton solution will satisfy a particular kind of a bound, which can be rewritten as this exactly the same thing as the charge is should be less than equal to the mass of the instanton
the
in this
weak
case.
gravity conjecture. Right,
So this in a gravitational case becomes the weak gravity conjecture, but this in the case of
right, right.
regular gauge theories is so this is known as BPS bound, or
Yeah,
these instanton states are known as BPS states. So the BPS bound, like in those cases, after some, I think, Boglomoni or something, some kind of a guy, and some Prasad and Sommerfeld. So the in case of instantons and in gauge theory, it's called as the BPS bound, which essentially, like at the very like basic form, what this BPS bound becomes is that suppose you have say x and y as two variables that you have, then we sort of know, like you can either call it AMGM inequality or something like that, that x plus y whole square has to be greater than whatever 2xy, I think, right? So this is known as has to be greater than xy. So this is the AMGM inequality that we use in regular arithmetic. So what the if you look at the instanton solutions of your gauge theory, what you realize is that you can rewrite down, like, and you can rewrite your Lagrangian or the Hamiltonian in the form of a plus b whole square, which you can then invoke the AMGM inequality to say that it should always be greater than 2ab, and then this essentially is the like the crux of your BPS argument, that the particular right hand side that we have a plus b whole square that corresponds to the mass essentially, or the energy momentum tensor of your gauge theory, and the left hand side corresponds to some kind of thing that counts your state, that counts your charge. And why that is the case, because if you look at the energy momentum tensor of your gauge theories, what you will have is that, like if you write down that in the form of F mu nu, you see that it has a very particular form, while on the left hand side, why the AB term counts the charge is because this AB term is essentially F mu nu, F star mu nu, which is a topological term. And that when integrated, like if you use the Stokes theorem, you know that it becomes a boundary term. And that boundary term essentially is the first Chern number of your on your manifold, which essentially counts the charge of your charge in the theory, in the gauge theory that you have. So like that is a very long-winded way of saying that if you use a very basic AMGM inequality, a plus b whole square has to be greater than 2ab, then that essentially is the crux of the BPS argument, why the mass of a black hole has all, like this particular case that you have for extreme black holes, that m has to be greater than equal to the charge essentially. Amartya, but one thing that I found very interesting in what you were describing here, I think you were describing how the positivity bounds arise and how they imply the weak gravity conjecture.
right.
But one very interesting thing, and I think this particular work dates back to before uh, any of the work on positivity bounds was even started, and this was the paper by Edward Witten on the positive energy theorem. So, have you read that paper?
I haven't, but I know that there is also a similar sounding paper by Rathadji where he, like an old paper, which is again kind of like all of this positivity bounds argument. But is it about null energy being violated by, the absence of positivity bonds or something like that.
So this particular paper is not. So the reason so this positive energy theorem, of course, this was not originally proved by Witten. This was originally proved by, I think, Yau and Schoen or something. So, but their proof was like supremely complicated, and what Witten did was that he used a very, very simple argument, which is something also that you alluded to, and I'll sort of explain it if I get the time. So, but Witten used a very beautiful argument to essentially show in a page or something that this positive energy theorem had to be true. Now, what the positive energy theorem is that suppose you have some classical general relativity, and essentially what it says is that if you have an asymptotically flat spacetime, and purely at the classical level, what you will have is that the like suppose you have uh, some kind of energy momentum distribution. What you can show is that at classical level, the mass of that distribution always has to be positive. So essentially, if you look at the
Right.
zero component of the energy momentum, it's also called the positive mass theorem or something. So
But
essentially,
isn't mass in gravitational theory is very like, I mean, for example, in general relativity, are you
right,
talking
right.
about the ADM mass, ADM energy?
Exactly. So that's why I said that it has to be an asymptotically flat system, because if it's an
Right.
asymptotic,
Right.
you can define some measure of a mass which is known as the ADM mass.
Right.
So the point is that energy itself is a very ill-defined quantity in gravitational theories. But one thing that you
Right.
can sort of you can sort of define an analog of mass if you are able to show that there exists a time like Killing vector in your space-time, which is also globally defined. So if you have a globally defined
Right.
time vector, then you can that's essentially corresponds to a mass. And that particular
Right.
mass is known as ADM mass for asymptotically flat spacetime. Now, what the beautiful idea about Witten's proof. So also the interesting thing is that this particular proof by Witten was one of the it was one of the four papers that was considered as the reason for giving him the Fields Medal. So
Oh, nice.
I think this his proof of I think this was the probably the main paper which was considered to be the one for given the Fields Medal. I think this positive energy theorem proof and his work on knot theory. Like these were like two of the most beautiful works that I think Michael
Right.
Atiyah on his Fields Medal committee he basically said that yeah, Witten is a physicist and his papers are also written in a physicist way, but I think like the the beautiful proofs that he has given in both and the work that he has done on knot theory, like if we do not give a Fields Medal to this guy, then probably no one else also deserves it. So like this was amazing. Now what
Right.
like the beautiful idea about Witten's proof was that so you essentially had to show that energy in like the ADM mass or the energy corresponding to your space-time in that satisfies particular assumptions. That always has to be positive. And from Einstein's field equations, what we know is that uh, uh, the essentially some combination of curvature is proportional to the energy momentum density. So we know that r mu nu minus half r g mu nu is proportional to the t mu nu in your space time. And so if you can essentially show some kind of a bound on this r mu nu kind of thing, you can sort of have a bound on the uh, t mu nu on the right hand side. And I
Right.
think the reverse of this argument is what the effective field theory people are trying to argue these days. So we sort of know that there are
Right.
these positivity bounds, and so you using the positivity bounds on T mu nu, you can sort of derive what kind of R mu nu, the R terms that you can have on the left hand side.
Right. Right.
So this is why it's very interesting, because again, the proof of Witten also uses a particular thing that you were alluding to right now. So what Witten tried to argue was, so I essentially have to show that there exists some bound on the kind like the R mu nu that I have in my equations. And so what Witten did was I think his original idea came from supergravity. So he was working with supersymmetric theories. So his point was that why don't I consider spinors in my gravitational spacetime? So he essentially proved the
Nice.
positive mass or the positive energy theorem in like a page or something. So this was
Nice.
like a brilliant idea of Witten. And I think that's exactly what your these positivity bounds and the this work on the effective field theory people are doing. but this time in the reverse direction.
Yeah.
So what you're
Yeah.
doing is, since you have a bound on the right hand side on the mass and the energy on your space time, you are trying to look at what kind of terms I can admit on the left hand side, such
Right.
that
Precisely.
these bounds are not violated. So this was like a very interesting idea by Witten. I think so. Witten original papers are like very beautiful things if you read them.
He also writes very well. He writes in a very lucid
This is
manner.
the thing that I am never able to understand, because if you talk to any academic, either in high energy theory or anything, because I think Witten's papers are ubiquitous. If you are in condensed matter or anything, I think there will be some point of time where you will be reading some foundational work by Witten. Now the point is that if you talk to any academic, every like 90% of them will tell you that Witten's talks are like totally non-understandable. His papers contain a lot of information. They'll be very like they'll be beautiful papers, but it will be very hard to decipher those papers. And the same goes for his talks. That if you like
His
the way
talks are annoying. His talks are very annoying.
so that's the thing. I don't find it. Like I have watched a lot of talks by Witten. Of course, I did not understand much, but every time I watch his talks, I like it. It just seems like very like I feel that
No,
it's a good
I
talk.
think the problem is not like like the way he presents material, but just his way of speaking is kind of
Right, right.
you
He has a very weird voice.
yeah, exactly. I think
I
that's
mean,
what puts
you
people off.
wouldn't like the his voice is very different from how you would think his voice might sound like or something. So that's one
Yeah,
thing.
right.
But the thing is that I've seen a lot of people complain about the fact that the way he organizes or the way he gives his talks is not how some regular person would organize his talks. Like he essentially gives talks in a way that he just writes down everything that comes to his mind, and then you have to connect all the dots or something like that. But I never found it that way, and I think even his
Yeah,
papers
no,
are
I don't.
very like they are not very
Yeah, I
super hard to understand. Like they are very straightforward if you just read them.
his papers are more like elegant essays. They're not very. I mean, he does not write a lot of unnecessary calculations and stupid
Exactly, dude. His
terms
paper,
or
his
symbols.
papers,
It's mostly words.
it's like
It's mostly words.
his
Oh
papers.
wow, then I'll definitely love to read a few of his papers, man. Like
Yeah, you should
with his
read
web
Witten's
posts.
papers. Like he writes amazing papers. Like there are a few papers by Witten that I think those papers it reads like a book, and they are also very long. Like I think 150 200 pages. Every paper of Witten is like more than 100 pages. So like I mean sometimes I just read the first 10 pages and give up. But still, like I like Witten's papers. I do not
They're
understand.
very lucid. They're very lucid. That nobody can deny.
And
Written
especially
writes very
if
well.
you read the very initial works by Witten, like his foundational works, his work on knot theory, I think his work on this positive energy theorem, his work on supersymmetric quantum mechanics. I think his work on supersymmetric quantum mechanics, which was also considered as one of the papers for his Fields Medal thing. Yeah, I think it's called supersymmetry and modes theory. So you basically don't have to if you want to like get into supersymmetry, if you want to study supersymmetry, never study any other resource except Witten's paper on supersymmetry and modes theory. You do not need to study anything else. There are a lot of
Right.
resources on the market, like a lot of books where people just complicate how to study supersymmetry and things like that. Like there is a book by Wiss and Bagger, which is essentially
Yeah.
considered to be the standard
The
textbook
Bible.
of supersymmetry,
Yeah.
but it's a horrible book. I never
Yeah, it's
liked
a waste of time. It's a very annoying. I never
it.
liked
Right. So this is the thing. Like, I mean, I do not like to give reading suggestions. Like, if you talk to any, say, a junior or someone, every time you talk to them about physics or anything, the first question from their mouths is that, oh, what is the book? What book should I refer to study this, or something like that. So that's one of the reasons why I do not like talking to juniors. For one,
Dostoevsky.
exactly. I always tell them read a storybook or a novel or something like, which
Right.
also brings me to the point about I think studying for one, because I think this is a topic that a lot of people in ICER like to talk about. Like if you are at a particular institute like ICER, uh, one thing is that there are a lot of uh, there are a lot of people that keep on offering you free advice and things like that, and most of those people
Uh-huh.
don't turn out to be your seniors. So one thing that I guess I realized when I was in my first or second year was that you should just take your advice by your seniors with a grain of salt, because for one, some things work for some people, some things do not work for other people. And also, I mean, uh, I guess that's also the thing why we do not like the curriculum and things like that. That when you ask a lot of people for say some references or reading advice, the kind of things that they suggest you, or the kind of things that seem to be the standard references, are the ones where uh, you essentially have a chain of how do you say, like it's like a chain of things that you first have to study this thing, then it will lead you to this thing, and then you will have this thing,
Right.
and
It's like a
finally,
linear progression.
right, it's like exactly, it's a linear progression. So they'll always suggest a linear progression of things, that you study this book, and then finally you will be able to understand that, which, I mean, I think we have ranted about,
Is garbage. Is
which is
garbage.
garbage, which is stupid, like a lot of bad adjectives I can use here. And I think we ranted about this a lot in the academia episode also.
Right.
But also the thing is that uh, this linear way of studying things is like something I do not like, because essentially you can, like, suppose I want to study a particular thing. If you are sort of clear in your mind what you want to study, then I would say that there always exists a particular way of reading the through the stuff very non-linearly, such that you will be able to understand that stuff very well. Of course, there will
Right.
be things that you do not understand along the way, but the thing is that once you study like in a very non-linear fashion or whatever works for you, once you have like once the idea is very clear in your mind, you will be able to read the other stuff and be able to connect it with what you already know. So
Right.
that's the
Also, often things that you are like reading right now as part of your linear progression, you don't understand them now, but you realize that after you've somehow reached the end of your progression, then you can come back and then you actually understand.
right.
You don't understand it at all.
That's the thing. So that's the thing with this linear progression of studying things, that you read through like there is a list of things that you have to do. So you do that, like, in some sense very mindlessly. You don't think about why you are doing the next thing, or why you did the previous thing to do this thing. And most of this will sound like, most of the things that you're doing will seem very disconnected from each other. But the point is that doing one, like, working through them in this particular chain will allow you to finally connect everything when you reach the end of your whatever this progression that you have. And this is also a thing, and like I think this is a thing about formalized systems, like things like curriculums and anything that's very formalized in this way. So for example, if you say, I think Santosh is taking piano classes, or he was taking piano classes. So if I remember, Santosh,
I completely agree.
so
Like
yeah,
those are for people who want to play it, in a masterful way, who want to learn music
exactly.
theory and
So this is exactly what I was
they just
alluding
want to
to.
have fun.
If you like, so one thing that I probably should not say, but the thing is that these formula systems, the reason that they exist is because there is some guy who wants to make money off by teaching you this particular thing. But the thing is that this is not a bad thing, I would say. Like, of course, the guy is making money off you studying in a formula system. That's fine, because essentially, if you mindlessly follow that particular formula system that the guy is giving you, then you can actually achieve mastery in that particular thing. That's for sure. But the point is that like, if you are sort of content with not being a master of that particular thing, at least in the short run, then what you can do is that you can sort of rearrange that thing. Like, you can study or whatever, work through that thing in a very non-linear fashion, and you can actually learn a very large amount of stuff in a very short amount of time. So, for example, Santosh, when you were
It's a
doing,
question of efficiency. It's just a question of efficiency. You tailor make your
uh,
own program and it will be more efficient than whatever.
so I
the
mean,
thing has been
of
there.
course, it depends upon whether it would be efficient or not. I think so. Like, just off the top of my head, I would say it's not very efficient to rearrange that thing, because for one, you have to sift through a lot of material by yourself, and then you have to make the entire decision about what sort of things you have to consider next. So that's very inefficient. If you, on the other hand, if you have a formalized system where you know what the next step you have to do, for example, say Santosh is doing piano. So if you look at like a general progression of people who do piano for 2-3 years, what they'll be doing is they'll be learning scales, they'll be learning chord progressions, they'll be learning all these I think the classical movements and stuff like that. So for a long period of time, you'll just be doing scales and these things. and probably not be doing something that's music in some sense, like music for us, for uncultured people like us, right? Like you probably, if you just follow that particular formal system, you won't be able to play, say, some pop music or something like that. But then on the other hand, for uh, someone like Santosh who wants to play piano for their own satisfaction, what they can do is that they can probably do those scale practices and stuff, but they can totally check the system and then look at some YouTube tutorials about how to play the pop music by themselves. And I think that so that's the thing that, like, I think that's a trade-off between efficiency, mastery, and probably personal satisfaction. So
Right.
I mean, I guess they, like, it probably does not make much sense, but I mean, Santosh, probably if you would like to comment here. But my point is that I suppose for every formal system that we have out there of studying or learning anything, there always exists a way that you can non-linearly arrange that entire thing. And like if you follow that by yourself, of course it will be a bit inefficient, but after you end up doing all that, you will end up learning a lot more than someone who's basically just following the formal system. But the thing is that the guy who's probably following that formal system will probably be more proficient, more efficient, and even more skillful than you. I mean, that guy will
But not happier.
that's probably my point. My point was that you will probably be more satisfied and happy than the guy who is probably following that formal system. Right. I mean, this is too much bitching about system and things like that. So I think this is a good place to end this particular podcast episode.
Yes. And Santosh, those samosas better have been fucking worth it, because now I'm late for football.